In 2019, the President of the United States suggested buying Greenland. For most of the world, the idea sounded absurd. Greenland is cold. It is sparsely populated, and to many people, it seems isolated from the centers of power. Late-night shows laughed it off. Political analysts treated it like a distraction. And even US allies reacted with disbelief, but the reaction itself revealed something deeper. Because when powerful nations make moves that look irrational, history shows they usually aren't. They're just operating on a map most people aren't looking at. Greenland is not just an island. It is a geographic lever, a military platform, a digital choke point, a future trade hub, and a vault of resources the modern world desperately needs. Trump didn't randomly choose Greenland. Greenland chose him, or rather, geography did. Because in geopolitics, location is destiny, and Greenland's location makes it impossible to ignore. So if Greenland isn't a joke, the next question is obvious. Why do powerful nations see it so differently from everyone else? To understand why Greenland matters, you first have to understand how superpowers think. Superpowers do not think in election cycles. They do not think in headlines. They think in decades, sometimes centuries. They think in geography. Every empire in history has been shaped not by ideology, but by terrain. Rome expanded along roads and rivers because those were the highways of the ancient world. The Roman legions could march 20 miles per day on paved roads. Without those roads, Rome would have been just another Italian city-state. Britain dominated oceans because islands breed sailors. When your survival depends on the sea, you become masters of it. The British Empire didn't conquer a quarter of the world through superior values. They did it through superior logistics, coal stations in every ocean, naval bases on every continent, the ability to project power anywhere, anytime. The United States learned this lesson and perfected it. After World War II, America didn't just win militarily, it won geographically. Bases in Germany, Japan, South Korea, Turkey. The post-war order wasn't about democracy versus communism. It was about controlling the geography that controlled everything else. Trump's worldview fits squarely inside this tradition. He views power physically. Land equals leverage. Control equals security. Proximity equals influence. This isn't ideology, it's geometry. That is why, in 2017, Trump grouped Greenland with the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal isn't symbolic. It is a global bottleneck. Every year, 14,000 ships pass through it. 5% of all global trade moves through a channel that is 50 miles long. Control it, and you influence global trade. Threaten it, and you can hold the world economy hostage. Trump was saying something very specific. Greenland is a choke point. Not for ships, but for something far more critical. For missiles, for data, for resources, for the future itself. Denmark and Greenland responded with outrage, but outrage does not erase strategic reality because the US military never laughed. The Pentagon didn't dismiss it. The Joint Chiefs didn't mock it. They already knew what Trump was saying out loud. They had known for 70 years. This way of thinking isn't new. And when it comes to Greenland, the United States didn't just stumble onto it. American interest in Greenland predates the United States as a global superpower. In the 19th century, the US was obsessed with territorial expansion. Manifest Destiny wasn't just about reaching the Pacific. It was about controlling every piece of valuable geography within reach. After buying Alaska in 1867 for $7.2 million, American officials immediately looked north and east. Secretary of State William Seward, the man who purchased Alaska, also inquired about Greenland and Iceland. Why? Because even then, strategists understood that Arctic territory meant control over future trade and military routes. The world was opening up. Telegraph cables were being laid across oceans. Steamships were conquering distances that had once taken months, and those who controlled the routes controlled the commerce. Congress rejected the purchase in the 1860s, calling it Seward's Folly, the same name they gave to Alaska, but the idea never died. It went dormant, waiting for the moment when the world would catch up to the map. In 1916, that moment arrived. Denmark needed cash desperately. World War I was draining European treasuries. The US wanted strategic depth in the Atlantic. The result was a deal. The Danish West Indies, now the US Virgin Islands, for $25 million and American recognition of Danish sovereignty over Greenland. This moment matters deeply because from then on, Greenland was politically Danish, but strategically American. That tension has never gone away, it has only intensified. World War II proved it beyond any doubt. When Nazi Germany occupied Denmark in April 1940, Greenland instantly became vulnerable. The Danish government was powerless. The island was exposed, and the United States moved in without hesitation. Airfields, ports, weather stations, communication hubs. Greenland became a military asset overnight. American forces arrived to protect Greenland from Nazi occupation. But protection is a flexible word, because unlike most wartime occupation, the Americans never really left, even after the war ended, even after Denmark regained its sovereignty. The bases remained, the radar stayed, the troops rotated, but the presence endured because once you occupy strategic ground, giving it up becomes almost impossible. What started as wartime necessity slowly became something far more permanent. There is a pattern in military history that few people recognize. When a superpower establishes a military presence somewhere strategically critical, that presence tends to outlast the original justification. The US has troops in Germany 80 years after World War II ended. In Japan, 79 years after Hiroshima. In South Korea, 71 years after the armistice. These aren't occupations in the traditional sense. They're permanent strategic investments, and they persist because geography doesn't change. Threats evolve, ideologies shift, leaders come and go, but the land stays exactly where it is. Greenland follows this exact pattern. The Nazis are gone. The Soviet Union collapsed, but Pituffik Space Base, formerly Thule Air Base, remains operational. It remains critical because the Arctic hasn't moved, and the logic of Arctic control has only become more urgent. This creates a strange contradiction. Denmark is a sovereign nation. Greenland is a self-governing territory within the Kingdom of Denmark, but the United States has maintained a military installation on Greenland for more than 80 years. That base exists because of a bilateral agreement. But agreements can be renegotiated, terminated, or revoked. What happens if Greenland becomes independent and decides it no longer wants a US military presence? What happens if Denmark, facing domestic political pressure, decides to end the arrangement? What happens if a rival power offers Greenland a better deal? These are the questions that keep Pentagon planners awake at night. Because losing Greenland doesn't just mean losing a base. It means losing the North American defense perimeter. But permanence alone doesn't explain Greenland's true importance. That only became clear once the world entered the nuclear age. The Cold War transformed Greenland from useful to essential. During the nuclear standoff with the Soviet Union, geography became destiny. Intercontinental ballistic missiles do not fly in straight lines on flat maps. They follow the curvature of the Earth, and when you plot the shortest route between the US and Russia on a globe, that route passes directly over the Arctic, over Greenland. This is called a Great Circle route, and it changed everything. This made Greenland the front line of nuclear detection. Missiles launched from Siberia toward Washington, New York, or Chicago would be detected here first. Minutes matter in nuclear war, seconds even. The difference between detection and devastation could be measured in heartbeats. That is why, in 1946, the US offered Denmark $100 million for Greenland. Adjusted for inflation, that would be over $1.5 billion today. Denmark refused, but they allowed something arguably more important: permanent US military presence under the 1951 Defense Agreement. This wasn't charity. Denmark was a small nation in a dangerous neighborhood. The Soviet Union was expanding. Eastern Europe was falling behind the Iron Curtain. Denmark needed American protection, and protection came with conditions. Today, that presence exists as Pituffik Space Base. The base houses massive radar arrays that can detect launches from thousands of miles away. It tracks satellites in orbit. It monitors potential threats in real time, and it anchors America's entire Arctic defense network. Without Greenland, the US loses early warning time. In nuclear strategy, that time is everything. 10 extra minutes can mean the difference between a coordinated response and catastrophic failure. But there's another layer to this story, one that Denmark and Greenland weren't told about for decades. In 1968, a US B-52 bomber carrying 4 hydrogen bombs crashed near Thule Air Base. The bombs didn't detonate, but they scattered radioactive material across the ice. The cleanup operation, codenamed Project Crested Ice, involved thousands of Danish and Greenlandic workers. Many were not informed about the radiation risks. Denmark claimed it had a strict policy against nuclear weapons on its soil. But documents released years later revealed that Danish officials had quietly agreed to allow nuclear-armed aircraft. The policy was a lie. The public was deceived, and Greenlanders were put at risk without their knowledge or consent. This wasn't just a diplomatic scandal. It was a betrayal, and it deepened the rift between Greenland and Denmark. Yet today, the most dangerous threats no longer arrive on ballistic trajectories. In the 21st century, war rarely begins with explosions. It begins with disruption, cyber attacks, propaganda, economic sanctions, and the severing of critical infrastructure. Under the oceans lie fiber optic cables that carry more than 95% of all international data, financial transactions worth trillions of dollars, military commands, government communications, the global internet itself. These cables are thin, often no thicker than a garden hose. They are fragile, and they are extremely difficult to protect. Many of the most critical cables pass through a region known as the GIUK gap. Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom. This narrow corridor is the digital spine of the Western world. Every email sent from Europe to America passes through here. Every stock trade between London and New York. Every military communication between NATO headquarters and North American forces. All of it flows through cables lying on the ocean floor. Russia knows this. For years, Russian submarines have been detected loitering near undersea cables, mapping them, studying them, practicing how to cut them. In 2023, European officials raised alarms about a Russian research vessel that was observed operating near critical cable routes. The vessel had no clear scientific purpose. It was equipped with deep-sea submersibles, and it was operating in areas where cable sabotage would cause maximum disruption. China, too, is investing heavily in Arctic infrastructure. Research stations, icebreakers, satellite ground stations. Beijing has even published official documents describing China as a near-Arctic state, a term with no basis in geography or international law, but it signals intent. Denmark, despite its best efforts, lacks the resources to patrol this vast area alone. The Danish Navy has a few patrol vessels. Greenland has virtually no military capacity of its own. For the US, that creates a strategic vulnerability. Because if those cables are cut, the West doesn't just lose internet service, it loses financial systems, command and control networks, early warning systems, the ability to coordinate a response to the very attack that severed the cables. Greenland is not just land, it is a switchboard, and in modern war, the switchboard is the battlefield. And while data cables are vulnerable on the ocean floor, the real contest is happening beneath the ice itself. Beneath the Arctic ice, a silent game is being played. A game most people don't know exists. However, it's one of the most dangerous competitions on Earth. Submarine warfare in the Arctic is unlike anywhere else. The ice creates acoustic shadows, areas where sonar becomes unreliable. Submarines can hide under ice shelves, invisible to satellites and surface ships. They can launch missiles from positions that would be impossible in open ocean, and as the ice melts, these hiding spots are changing. Russia operates the world's largest fleet of icebreakers. More than 40 vessels, including nuclear-powered giants capable of smashing through ice several meters thick. The United States has 2 functional icebreakers. 2. That disparity is not accidental. Russia is preparing for an Arctic future. The US is still catching up, and Greenland sits at the center of the routes these submarines must travel. The Denmark Strait, the passage between Greenland and Iceland, is one of the few deep-water routes out of the Arctic. Russian submarines leaving their northern bases must pass through here to reach the Atlantic. During the Cold War, the US and NATO established a network of underwater listening stations to track these movements. That network still exists. It's called SOSUS, the Sound Surveillance System, and much of it relies on sensors positioned near Greenland. If Greenland's strategic relationship with the US were to change, this entire surveillance network could be compromised. NATO would lose its ability to track submarine movements. The Atlantic would become opaque. And Russia would gain freedom of movement it hasn't had since the 1980s. This is why Greenland isn't just about what's on the island. It's about what's around it. For decades, ice kept this competition contained. That barrier is now disappearing. For centuries, Arctic ice was nature's wall. It made the region inaccessible for most of the year. It protected the Arctic from exploitation, and it kept geopolitical competition frozen in place. Now it is melting and melting fast. Since 1979, Arctic sea ice has declined by about 13% per decade. Summer ice coverage has shrunk by nearly half. Scientists predict the Arctic could be ice-free in summer within the next 2 decades. This is an environmental catastrophe, but it is also a geopolitical revolution. As ice retreats, shipping routes open routes that shorten journeys between Asia, Europe, and North America by thousands of miles. The Northern Sea Route along Russia's Arctic coast can cut the distance between Shanghai and Rotterdam by 40% compared to the Suez Canal. The Northwest Passage through Canada's Arctic archipelago offers similar savings. These routes could rival the Suez and Panama Canals in value, and Greenland sits directly beside them. Ships using these routes will need ports for refueling, repairs, and crew changes. They will need search and rescue infrastructure. They will need insurance and legal frameworks. Greenland could become the Singapore of the North, a critical service hub for Arctic shipping, or it could become a dependent backwater, watching others profit from its location. Russia is building Arctic bases at unprecedented speed. More than 400 military installations along its Arctic frontier. New airfields, radar stations, missile batteries, port facilities. Moscow is preparing to dominate Arctic shipping, to charge tolls, to set rules, to control access. China, despite being thousands of miles from the Arctic, calls itself a near-Arctic state. Beijing has invested billions in Arctic research. It has built the world's largest non-nuclear icebreaker fleet. It has signed agreements with Iceland, Norway, and Russia for access to Arctic routes and resources. Why? Because China's economy depends on global trade, and Arctic routes could save Chinese companies billions of dollars per year in shipping costs. Climate change is not just environmental, it is geopolitical, and Greenland is ground zero. But there's a darker side to this transformation because shipping routes bring more than cargo. They bring military vessels, surveillance platforms, geopolitical competition. The Arctic was peaceful because it was empty. As it fills with ships, that peace becomes fragile. But shipping routes aren't the only reason the world is paying attention to Greenland. Beneath Greenland's ice lies extraordinary mineral wealth. Lithium for batteries, graphite for energy storage, rare earth elements for electronics, missiles, and satellites, zinc, lead, gold, and uranium. The U.S. Geological Survey estimates Greenland may hold some of the world's largest undiscovered reserves of rare earth elements. These aren't luxury goods. They are the foundation of modern technology. Your smartphone contains more than a dozen rare earth elements. Electric vehicle batteries require lithium, cobalt, and nickel. Wind turbines use neodymium and dysprosium. Fighter jets, missile guidance systems, and satellites all depend on these materials. Modern civilization runs on these materials, and right now, China controls the supply chain. China produces 60% of the world's rare earth elements, but more importantly, China refines about 85% of them. Even rare earths mined in other countries are often shipped to China for processing. This gives Beijing enormous leverage. In 2010, during a territorial dispute with Japan, China briefly restricted rare earth exports. Japanese manufacturers panicked. The message was clear. Resource dependence is political vulnerability. For the United States, this is a strategic nightmare. The Pentagon relies on rare earths for weapons systems. The renewable energy transition depends on them. And the supply chain runs through a geopolitical rival. Greenland offers an alternative, a Western source of critical minerals. A supply chain that doesn't run through Beijing. However, extracting these resources is not simple. Greenland has a population of about 56,000 people. For context, that's roughly the population of Cheyenne, Wyoming. Large-scale mining operations require tens of thousands of workers, engineers, geologists, heavy equipment operators, support staff. That labor would have to come from abroad, which introduces social, political, and cultural instability. Imagine a town of 5,000 people suddenly having 10,000 foreign workers arrive. The culture changes overnight. Housing costs explode, social tensions rise, and local governance becomes overwhelmed. This has happened before. In Mongolia, rare earth mining brought Chinese investment and workers. It also brought corruption, environmental degradation, and social disruption. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, cobalt mining has funded militias and perpetuated violence. In Papua New Guinea, mining operations have destroyed rivers and displaced communities. Resource wealth does not guarantee prosperity. Often, it guarantees conflict. This is called the resource curse. Countries rich in natural resources frequently suffer from poverty, corruption, and authoritarianism. Why? Because resource extraction creates concentrated wealth that can be captured by elites. It distorts economies away from sustainable development, and it invites foreign interference. Greenland is not immune to this curse. In fact, its small population and limited governance capacity make it especially vulnerable. If Greenland opens itself to large-scale mining, who will benefit? The Greenlandic people? Or foreign corporations and distant governments? History suggests the answer is rarely the local population, which brings Greenland to a crossroads. Because controlling resources is meaningless without controlling your own future. Greenland has its own parliament, its own language, Kalaallisut, spoken by most of the population, its own flag, its own culture, distinct from Denmark and deeply rooted in Inuit traditions, and a growing desire for independence. In 2009, Greenland achieved self-governance. This gave Greenland control over most domestic affairs, police, education, natural resources, but foreign policy, defense, and currency remain under Danish control. Many Greenlanders see full independence as the next logical step, a chance to control their own future, to benefit from their own resources, to escape the shadow of colonialism. But independence is expensive. Denmark currently provides roughly $500 million per year in subsidies. This represents about 20% of Greenland's total economy. It pays for healthcare, education, infrastructure, and public services. Without that money, Greenland faces a brutal choice: cut services dramatically or find another source of revenue. Mining offers one path, but as we've seen, mining brings its own risks. Tourism offers another. Greenland attracts about 100,000 tourists per year. That's twice the local population. However, tourism infrastructure requires massive investment. Hotels, roads, airports, emergency services, and tourism is seasonal, creating boom and bust economic cycles. There is a third option, one that Greenland's leaders have been quietly considering: strategic partnerships, allowing foreign powers to invest in exchange for access and influence. China has already made offers. In 2018, Chinese state-owned companies proposed financing the expansion of 3 airports in Greenland. The US intervened, pressuring Denmark to reject the deal. Eventually, Denmark itself funded the airports to keep China out. This was not about altruism, it was about control, because whoever builds Greenland's infrastructure shapes its future. Without Danish support, Greenland would need foreign capital. Foreign capital demands influence. Foreign influence reshapes politics, and in extreme cases, it creates oligarchies. We have seen this pattern before. In Central Asia, Chinese investment has come with strings attached. Belt and Road Initiative projects often require using Chinese labor, Chinese companies, and Chinese debt terms. Countries that cannot repay loans have been forced to hand over strategic assets. Sri Lanka ceded control of Hambantota, port to China for 99 years after defaulting on debt. Greenland risks trading Danish oversight for something far worse: a new form of dependency. One where Greenland answers not to Copenhagen, but to Beijing, or Washington, or Moscow. Independence without economic sovereignty is not really independence at all. It is simply choosing your patron. And for many Greenlanders, the debate over independence can't be separated from the past. Trump did not invent America's interest in Greenland. He vocalized it, bluntly, publicly, without diplomatic language, and in doing so, he forced a conversation that had been whispered in backrooms for decades into the global spotlight. But here's what most people misunderstood. Ownership was never the goal. Influence was. The United States doesn't need to own Greenland. It just needs to ensure that no rival power controls it. This is the logic of hegemony, not conquest, but primacy. There is a model for this. It's called a Compact of Free Association. The United States has these agreements with 3 Pacific Island nations: Palau, the Marshall Islands, and the Federated States of Micronesia. Here's how it works. The island nations remain sovereign. They control their own governments, laws, and domestic policies, but the United States provides defense. U.S. military forces protect the islands from external threats. In exchange, the U.S. gains exclusive military access. No other power can establish bases there. Trade flows freely between the nations. Citizens can live and work in the United States without visas, and the U.S. provides substantial financial aid. It's not colonialism, it's strategic partnership with clear benefits on both sides. For Greenland, such an arrangement could offer exactly what it needs: economic support to replace Danish subsidies, security guarantees from the world's most powerful military, access to American markets, technology, and investment, and most importantly, sovereignty. Greenland keeps its flag, its government, its identity. No invasion, no purchase, no empire, just power. Exercised quietly, but there's a catch. These agreements are not truly equal. The U.S. has far more leverage. It can withdraw support if its conditions aren't met. It can influence domestic politics through aid and access, and it can veto foreign relationships it considers threatening. For Greenland, this would mean independence from Denmark, but dependence on Washington. The question is whether that trade is worth it. Whether Greenlanders would accept American influence in exchange for American support, or whether they would seek a different path. A truly independent Greenland, navigating between superpowers. History suggests that option is the most dangerous of all. But while Trump spoke loudly, other countries were making quieter moves. While the world focused on Trump's blunt offer, other players were making quieter moves. Canada has its own Arctic concerns. The Northwest Passage runs through Canadian territory. But as ice melts, the United States and other nations have challenged Canada's sovereignty over these waters. If Canada cannot control its own Arctic routes, what does sovereignty even mean? Ottawa has watched American interest in Greenland with deep concern, because U.S. control of Greenland would essentially encircle Canadian Arctic territory. Norway, too, has a stake. The Svalbard archipelago, far north of mainland Norway, sits near critical Arctic shipping lanes. Norway is a NATO member, but it maintains a delicate balance with Russia. Norwegian officials have quietly increased Arctic patrols. They know that any shift in Greenland's status could destabilize the entire region. Iceland, the third point of the GIUK gap, is already hosting U.S. forces, but Iceland has no standing army. It depends entirely on NATO for defense. Any change in Greenland's relationship with the U.S. could force Iceland into an even more dependent position. And then there is the European Union. Greenland left the EU's predecessor in 1985 over fishing rights, but Greenland remains associated with the EU through Denmark. If Greenland becomes fully independent and aligns with the United States, the EU loses influence over a strategically critical territory. Brussels has been watching carefully, offering development funds, encouraging dialogue, trying to keep Greenland within the European orbit. These quiet players don't make headlines. However, they are shaping the Arctic's future just as much as the superpowers. And amid all this strategic maneuvering, it's easy to forget who lives at the center of it. It is easy to talk about Greenland as a strategic asset, a choke point, a vault of resources, a military platform. However, 56,000 people live there. They have families, traditions, hopes for the future, and they are watching their homeland become the subject of a geopolitical auction. Greenland's population is predominantly Inuit. Their ancestors survived in one of Earth's harshest environments for thousands of years. Through ingenuity, adaptation, and deep knowledge of the land and sea, but climate change is destroying that world. Traditional hunting routes are becoming unreliable. Ice that was once predictable is now unstable. Animals are migrating differently. The land their ancestors knew is disappearing. Meanwhile, outside powers are arriving with plans. Plans for mines, for military bases, for shipping hubs, for infrastructure projects that will transform Greenland forever, and Greenlanders are being asked to choose. To choose between economic development and environmental preservation, between independence and security, between cultural identity and global integration. These are impossible choices, yet they must be made. Some Greenlanders welcome development. They see mining and tourism as paths to prosperity, a way to build schools, hospitals, and modern infrastructure, a way to give their children opportunities they never had. Others resist. They see the same promises made to indigenous peoples around the world. Promises that led to displacement, environmental destruction, cultural erosion, and they refuse to repeat that history. The Greenlandic government tries to balance these perspectives, but it is a small government with limited capacity. Managing negotiations with Denmark, the United States, China, and the European Union simultaneously is overwhelming, and the stakes couldn't be higher because the decisions made in the next decade will determine Greenland's fate for the next century. Which brings us back to the question no map can answer. Greenland is not the prize. The future is, and Greenland sits at its center. The Arctic is warming twice as fast as the rest of the planet. As it melts, it will reshape global trade, military strategy, and resource politics. The nations that control Arctic geography will control the 21st century's most valuable routes and resources. That is why Trump mentioned Greenland, why Russia is building bases, why China is investing billions, why Denmark is suddenly interested in funding airports. They all see the same map. They all understand the same logic. Geography is destiny, and Greenland's geography makes it impossible to ignore. The question is not whether Greenland will change. It will. The question is who will benefit from that change? The Greenlandic people or the powers circling above them? History offers few examples of small nations successfully navigating great power competition, but history is not destiny. Greenland has something most small nations don't: leverage. Every superpower needs Greenland more than Greenland needs any single superpower. If Greenlanders can recognize that leverage, if they can resist the temptation of quick deals and easy money, if they can build the institutions necessary to manage their own future, then perhaps Greenland can be the exception. A small nation that survives the great game, not by choosing a side, but by making the sides compete for Greenland's favor. That would be true sovereignty, whether it wants to or not. Greenland is already in the game. The only question is whether it will be a player or a prize. Let's keep the conversation going in the comments. What do you think will be the fate of Greenland? Please like, comment, and subscribe to support the channel so we can bring you more answers to questions you never knew mattered on the global stage.